Hello and welcome back to my video series on 3D printing scale historical models. In this video, it's all about getting some paint on our models. So far, my students have been designing and building, and some of them even got paint on their model. And while we can say that there's definitely paint on this, it's not necessarily a paint job that enhances the overall look or shows off the features of their building. Our goal here is to show a little bit more detail and make it a bit more realistic. I would like to say thanks to Jeremy from Blackmagic Craft. He makes terrain for fantasy games and he has some great video tutorials on this topic. My video on painting here is a condensed version of a bunch of the tips he shows in his basics. I want to make a note that if you're watching a Blackmagic Craft video, the buildings he's making are quite a bit larger than the ones we are building in my videos. He's building for a 28mm or a 25mm scale, and at these scales, 25mm is the height of a standard human. We are building for an N scale, that's a model train scale, and it's a much smaller sized building than what you'll see in his videos, but a lot of the basic techniques still apply. So the first thing here, I'm going to go to my source for this building. It was a book on Montana women homesteaders. And I'm going to look at the reference picture I used and note some things in that image. Looking at this photo, I noticed a couple things. The roof is cedar shakes. They're probably a darker gray, weathered, worn wood. There appears to be wood trim around the doors and windows. There was white paint applied. It's probably a very basic white paint available at the time, maybe something like a lime wash, and this had a tendency to flake off pretty quick. I see that more of the paint is worn off lower on the building, and that's because the eaves of the roof protect the walls higher up. The other thing I see is that there's a little chimney in the background there that was probably made from a red clay brick that's available in the area, and the doors appear to be either a lighter gray or a tan or a brown. Really hard to tell from these black and white photos, so we're going to take some artistic liberties, but in general, I'm going to try to keep the color palette pretty muted and natural looking. The first thing we do after the model comes off the printer is clean it up some. There's a brim underneath that helps hold it to the printer, and there's some stray filaments, especially on the underhang areas. I didn't print with support. It's not very useful on such a small model, but all that needs to be cleaned up with a sharp knife. I use a cutting mat, and I'm real careful how I go about this. And once the loose plastic is cleaned up, you can go ahead and sand it if you like. I like the layers on the walls of the building. It helps it look like wood siding, but I didn't care for the texture on the roof, and so I spent a little bit of time sanding that flat. I could have designed siding and shingles when I made this model, but it's such a small model, those details don't print real well. A small file helps me get into some of the detailed areas next to the chimney. When my model's cleaned up, I get a little block. It could be foam, wood, cork, a dot of hot glue, and I attach my model to it. This helps give me a little bit of a handle to hold onto my model while I'm painting. I'm going to prime this with some Mod Podge that has been colored with black paint. This is a tip from Blackmagic Crafts. It sticks pretty well and gives a nice base coat to paint on top of. I use a crappy brush for this. The Mod Podge is pretty hard on paintbrushes, and I work just to get a smooth, even coat. I don't get too much on, and I don't spend too much time doing this. Once everything's coated, I leave that to dry. You can speed it up with a hairdryer a bit, and when it's totally dry, it should have a nice flat matte finish look to it. When I'm ready to paint, I get a small, clean paintbrush, and because these models are so small, it just takes small dots of paint here. 3 drops will pretty much cover a whole model this size, so you don't need to squeeze very much paint out at all. Because the building had a lot of weathered wood to it, I'm going to start with a dark gray base coat and just cover the whole thing, even the areas that are going to have white painted on it later. That's going to make it easy for wood to show through that white paint. I get an even coat. I cover all the surfaces, including the chimneys and the windows. Once that's done and dry a bit, I'm going to give a little texture to the roof to kind of make it look like shingles. I take some gray paint and mix it with my dark paint to make a little lighter shade, and I'm just going to take a small detail brush and dab it on like there's little shingles and make a row pattern going across the top of the roof and work on all the roof surfaces. And once I have my roof, I'm going to take some red color and paint my chimney in, and then some light brown and paint in the doors. So I work real big areas, the overall structure, and then color block in other important components. Chimney, door, and now windows. I'm just going to go ahead and get black paint inside there. That's not a great way to do a window, but I think it looks okay. I'm not going to worry too much about if I get paint on the window trim. We'll go back and do window trim at the very end because it tends to get a lot of flecks of paint on it from the brush. And then once that color blocking's done, we're just going to go ahead and let that dry again. When everything's good and dry, we're going to add some texture with a technique called dry brushing. When we dry brush, we use just a tiny amount of paint in a dry paintbrush. We wipe off excess on a towel or a rag so that there's just a tiny amount on there, and we scrub it into the surface. And the paint comes off on the high points and creates a little textured look. I'm using just a light gray here. It's lighter than the dark gray we initially put on, and it helps give just a weathered wood look. Once that's done, I'm going to start painting the white paint that was on the building. I'm using a vanilla white here, which is kind of a warm off-white color. And I'm going to make sure I cover under the eaves of the roof well, and then as I get towards the lower part of the building walls, I'm going to use less and less paint, and it's more of a dry brush technique. I'm going real fast, and this is real messy here. I can see I've got lots of dots of paint on trim and the edges of the roof, but I'm going to try to clean that up a little bit later. Once the off-white paint had dried, I decided I needed to dry brush the roof a little bit. I didn't get any texture on those shingles, so I go back here with another coat of light gray and just dry brush the roof. I want to mention that there's a lot more YouTube resources available. Painting fantasy miniatures and fantasy terrain is a pretty popular subgenre on YouTube, and there's a lot of great video tutorials out there. One of my favorites is Emil Nystrom from Squidmar. I'll post a link to one of his videos below. I think that's also worth checking out and seeing some actual good painting techniques. Once the off-white's dry, I'm going to go back over with a bright white paint and just a thin layer somewhere between normal painting and dry brushing. And I'm going to just try to add a little bit more detail to that white paint to make it look like it's worn. And once the white paint is done, I'm going to use a light gray, and I'm going to go around the trim for each door and each window, and around the edges of the roof and the very top edge of the roof. This is just going to help highlight those areas, it's going to show contrast, and it's going to make those features pop a bit. I'm just about done here. I'm going to take some black paint, and I'm going to dry brush some soot around the chimney. Once all of my paint is good and dry, I'm going to go over it with a wash. A wash is a type of glazing technique where thin, transparent paint is applied over layers of other paint. For my wash, I'm using a formula from Black Magic Craft. It's water with a little flow enhancer to help it run nicely, some acrylic medium which helps it stick, and then acrylic black and brown ink. It's really thin, light colored, and it just gives it an overall dingy hue. I apply a few drops to each surface and use a paintbrush to spread it around. On the areas that I want to be bright white, I dab a little bit of that off so my white paint still shows. Otherwise, I let that drip and run into the little crevices. They'll make those darker and look more natural. It's important to let this just dry naturally. You don't want to blow dry this. You want to give it time for that ink to flow into the crevices. When the wash is dried, it can be removed from the base. Now this is not a great example. I'm not real proficient at this, and I found it real difficult to paint with my arms wrapped around my camera and woven in between my lights. My earlier practices were quite a bit better. If you look real close, you can see it's pretty messy. I got a lot of paint on my door trim. I don't have the paint up into the crevices underneath the roof, and I'm not very happy with how those shingles look. Also, I'm working really quick here. It was 45 minutes from the start of painting to the finished product that included drying time and setting up my camera and filming. What's really important at the end of the day is how it looks compared to the original. I'm going to post a link to this model if you want to 3D print it and follow along using the same structure. It's available in the description down below. And if you're one of my students, I've already printed out a whole bunch of these. Come grab one, practice your painting techniques. I'd love to make a nice dystopian suburban area with all these sad identical houses. Also, if you're one of my students, I've made kits of materials available. I have the primer, the craft paints, small paintbrushes, and wash for you to try out. Thanks for watching. I really look forward to seeing the things that you guys make with this.